evening, everyone. In last session, we have discussion. We have discussion related to data JPA. Data JPA, Spring Data JPA is used to develop persistence layer in our Spring-based applications. Spring Data JPA is used to develop persistence layer in our Spring-based applications. Data JPA provided, Spring Data JPA provided predefined repositories to simplify CRUD operations implementation in our application. Spring Data JPA provided predefined repositories to simplify CRUD operations implementation in our application. Okay, now let's start developing one application by using Data JPA. Building first application using Spring Data JPA with Oracle database. First I am going to build first application I am building by using Data JPA with Oracle database. Okay, first one, set up database server software. Then create a table in the database. Create a table in database. Then create Spring Starter application. Create Spring Starter application with below dependencies. Create Spring Starter application with below dependencies. What are those? First one, Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. Second one, Oracle driver. These are the two dependencies that I'm going to take to develop my first application. Okay, set up database server that we have done in the yesterday's session. We need to create a table in the database, and we need to create a boot application with dependencies, Data JPA, Oracle driver, and we need to create entity class, and map with database table. Create entity class and map with database table. Create entity class and map with database table. Create repository interface. Create repository interface. Okay, then next one, test application. Configure data source properties. In application.properties file. Got it? So we need to perform these steps, guys. Database setup is already done. I need to create a table in the database, create a starter application with the below dependencies, boot starter data JPA, Oracle driver, create entity class and map with database table, create repository interface, configure data source properties in application.properties file. Right, now let's do this. I want to create a table in the database. Already we have database installed, and I have taken SQL Developer, which is a client software to communicate with the database. I have taken SQL Developer, which is a client software, and it is used to communicate with the database server. Now by using this client, I'm communicating with my Oracle database, and I will create a table here. by using my application, I will insert the record into that table. Okay, create table user details. Create a table user details. Now here I will take user underscore ID, which is a number. User underscore ID, user underscore name, that is varchar2 of some value. User ID, user name, user phone number, that is a number. Okay, user age, that is also a number. And I will take user country, that is a varchar, Now in this I will take primary key as user ID. I'm representing user ID as a primary key. Now you see already a table available with a name called users details. Let me make it as users details. Yeah, users details table got created. Now see how I have created a table in the database. Create table with a name called user details, user ID, user name, user phone number, user age, user country, and I have taken user ID as a primary key. Now I have created this table in the database. Now we need to develop a application to insert the data into this table. We need to develop the application to insert the data into this table. I hope all of you know how to create the table in the database. Now let's go and develop the application. File, new, Spring Starter application. So this is our 11th application, Spring Boot Data JPA application 1. Spring Boot Data JPA application 1. Okay, good. Maven build tool I have selected as a Maven. Packaging as jar, Java version 8, language Java. Group ID I'm taking in dot Ashok IT. Artifact ID, version, description and package. Click on next. Okay, we need to select the dependencies. Right now I'm selecting data JPA, Spring Data JPA I have selected. And I will select Oracle driver. Okay, these are the two dependencies sufficient to develop our first application by using this. Okay, click on next, click on finish. Yeah, project is getting created, guys. See this, the process progress. The project is getting created. Maven project is creating, downloading the dependencies. First time we are adding two dependencies, data JPA and Oracle. So it is downloading the dependencies which are required for that. Got my point? Perfect. Now, guys, see here, there are 11 projects available in my IDE. Project number 10 is open, project number 11 is open. But currently I am working on the project number 11. So there is no use of opening this. There is no use of keeping this project 10 open. Unnecessarily IDEs will become slow. Okay, I want to close the project which I am not using in the IDE. I want to close the project which is I am not using. So right click on this project which you are currently working on. I'm working on the project number 11. Right click on this. There is an option called close unrelated project. Close unrelated project. Now project number 10 is also closed. Only project number 11 is open. Then your IDE will be fast. Yesterday we have seen in the Ismail system, he opened all the projects in the IDE. That's why his IDE is getting hanged. So please, you open only the project which you are currently working on. How to close the remaining projects? Right click on the project, option called close unrelated projects. You will get the option close unrelated projects. That means all the remaining projects will be closed, only your project will be open. Okay, that's good. So this project is there. Go to pom.xml file. The people who are using MySQL, you need to select the MySQL driver, guys. Here I am developing application with the Oracle database. That's why I have selected Oracle driver. If you are using MySQL database, then you need to select the MySQL driver. Okay? Yeah. This is our pom.xml file. See here, we have this database, we have this dependency, data JPA, Spring Boot starter data JPA, and we have one more dependency called Oracle, OJDBC dependency I have selected. The people who are working with the MySQL database, they need to use this OJDB's MySQL driver they need to use. The people who are working with PostgreSQL, Postgres database dependency, the people who are working with MongoDB, Mongo dependency, the people who are working with Oracle dependency. So based on type of the database you are using, that the JDBC driver you have to select. Every database is having its own driver. So I'm using Oracle, so I have used Oracle driver which is OJDBC. Perfect. Next step, database is installed, table is also created. I have given the query also which is used to create the table. Project also created, 2 dependencies are selected, data JPA dependency, Oracle driver dependency. Now we need to create the entity class. Okay, observe carefully how I am going to create entity class. New class, I'm taking this class name as user class dot entity package. Inside this package I'm creating one class called user. This class is called as entity class because I will map this class with database table. Okay, what are the columns available in the table? What are the columns? User ID, username, phone number, age, country. There are 4 columns available, so we need 4 variables. Private integer user ID, private string username, private string user country, user ID, username, user country. 5 variables are there. ID, name, phone number, age, country. ID, name, phone number, private string user phone number, private integer user age. Got it? ID, name, phone number, age, country. Okay, user ID. So it is having user ID variable. Username, it is having variable. Phone number, variable. Age, country, available. So we have taken a class. Which is representing table structure. Now, how to represent this class as an entity? To represent this class as entity, we will use one annotation, entity annotation. Which annotation is used to represent our class as an entity, guys? Which annotation we are using to represent our class as an entity? @entity annotation. Entity is the annotation which we will use to represent our class as an entity. You got my point, na? @entity annotation we are using to represent our class as a entity. To represent our class as a entity, not entity scan, it is entity only. One second. Yeah. Entity is the annotation I am using. Now, after that, I'm using one annotation called table. I'm using an annotation table which is used to represent this class is mapping with which table? Users details. This class is mapping with which table? This class is mapping with user details table. Now see the name of the table, user details. Class name should map with the table name. User, it is mapping with user details. Now user ID, I'm going to take this as a ID. ID means it is a primary key. ID means it is a primary key. Now, user ID variable mapping with which column in the table by using @column. By using @column, we can map it. That is user underscore ID. That is user underscore ID. So similarly, for all the variables, we need to map. All the variables we need to map. Okay, user ID, username, user phone number, user age, and user country. Okay, user ID, username, user phone number, user age, user country. Okay, username, user phone number, user age, country. That's it. Look at this, guys. What are the annotations that I am using? Entity annotation I am using, table annotation I am using, ID annotation I am using, column annotation I am using. What is the purpose of entity? Entity is used to represent our class as a entity class. Table annotation is used to map our class with the table name. Then ID is used to represent this variable mapping with primary key column. What is the primary key column in this table? User ID is the primary key column. The variable, if you want to map the variable to the column, then we will use column annotation. Which variable mapped with the primary key column? To represent that, we will use ID annotation. I hope you are clear with 4 annotations I have used here. I hope you are able to understand 4 annotations I have used here. Then generate setters getters for the variables. Right click here, source, generate getters and setters. Okay, select all, click on generate. Along with the setters and getters, I want to override toString. Right click, source, generate toString. Okay, I have generated toString also. Alright, now this is our entity class. Look at this, entity annotation to represent this class as an entity class. Table annotation, it is used to map the class with the database table. ID, column. ID means this variable mapped with the primary key column. Column means mapping variable to the particular column name. Setters getters for the variables and a toString method also for the variables. Perfect. All of you clear with this? Entity class that I have created? Here you need to write setters, getters and toString. Setters, getters and toString. You need to write for the entity class. Okay. What is the purpose of entity? To represent Java class as entity class. @table to map Java class with database table name. @ID to represent variable which is mapped with primary key column. in table, @column, @column, to map variable, to map class variable, entity class variable name with table column name. Okay, what is the purpose of entity? To represent Java class as an entity class. Table, to map Java class with database table name. ID, to represent variable which is mapped with the primary key column in the table. Column, to map entity class variable name with the table column name. With the table column name. Perfect. Next, here note, table and column annotations are optional. Table and column annotations are optional. If we don't use table, it will consider class name as the table name. If we don't use column, it will consider variable name as column name. Okay, can you guys read these points? What about entity class? Can you guys read these points about the entity class? Can you guys read this about the entity class? In the entity class, here, if you don't write the table name, class name, it will consider as a table name. But our scenario, class name and table name both are different. That's why I am writing @table. Column name. Here, variable name and column name, I am mapping. If I don't write the column, it will consider the variable name as column name. Okay. Tanu, I answered your question. If your variable name and column name are same, then no need to use column. If they are different, then you have to use it. Perfect. Now, let me create a repository interface. Observe this step, guys, clearly. Here I am going to create one interface. New interface. The interface name I am giving as user repository. Package name in.ashokit.repository. User repository I am giving as a interface name. Okay, this is normal interface. Does this interface contains any method? No. No methods. Now, here, guys, do you want me to write the logic to insert the record? You want me to call JPA methods to insert the record? Do you want me to write the logic, load the driver, get the connection, execute the query? Do you want me to write logic on my own, or you want me to use data JPA? We need to use the data JPA. Okay, in order to use the data JPA to perform the CRUD operations, our interface will extend the properties from one more interface called Crud Repository. Our interface will extend the properties from one more repository that is called Crud Repository. Crud Repository is the predefined repository available in data JPA. Now, whenever you extend the properties from Crud Repository, you can call the methods of the Crud Repository here. Sub interface can access super interface methods, right? Now go to Crud Repository. Control O. Can you see the methods which are available in the Crud Repository? Save method, save all method, find by ID, exist by ID, find all by ID, count, delete by ID, delete all by ID, delete all. So there are several methods available, almost 11 or 12 methods are available to perform CRUD operations. Now, can we directly call the methods by using this interface now? Yes, because our interface extending the properties from Crud repository. Crud repository is our interface or it is a predefined interface?
Predefined.
Crud repository is our interface or Crud repository is a predefined interface? Crud repository is a predefined interface. That Crud repository already having the methods to perform Crud operations. Crud repository already having methods to perform that Crud repository already having methods to perform Crud operations. Okay. Now here it is expecting two generic arguments. First one is T, second one is ID. T represents type of the entity. This repository should use which entity? User entity. What is the data type of the primary key? Primary key data type is integer. Number. That's it. That's it. Understand what I have done here? Understand what I have done here? I have created a interface with a name called, I have created one interface with a name called user repository. User repository interface should perform CRUD operations with the database. User repository interface should perform CRUD operations with the database. To perform CRUD operations with the database, I don't want to write the logic here. I want to call the methods provided by data JPA. To call the methods provided by the data JPA, my user repository extending the properties from CRUD repository. In order to perform the CRUD operations, my user repository interface extending the properties from CRUD repository interface. CRUD repository is a predefined interface which is having methods. Now see here, I'm opening source code of the CRUD repository and see the methods. Save method, save all method, find by ID method, exist by ID, find all by ID, count, delete by ID, delete all by ID, delete all. Like that, there are several methods already available. There are several methods already available in this CRUD repository. By using those methods, we can perform the operations. By using those methods, we can perform the operations. Look at this interface. Understand, this repository should perform the operations with the DB. So that's why I'm taking this CRUD repository. User is entity. This repository should use which class to perform the operations? User. Integer is a data type of the primary key, guys. What is the primary key data type we have to specify? What is the primary key data type we have to specify? Okay. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Now, let's go to steps. Let's go to steps here, guys. Yeah. Entity class also we have completed. Repository interface also we have completed. Repository interface we are creating by using JPA. Repository, nothing, that's it. If you create a repository by extending the properties from Crud repository, that is sufficient. Okay. Now go to resources, application dot properties. What we need to do? Configure data source properties. Na? We need to configure data source properties here. How to configure the data source properties here? Spring dot data source dot driver class. Which driver class we are using? What is the driver class for the database? Okay, driver class spring dot data source dot URL, username and password. Username, you don't need to type everything, guys. You just type spring dot data source. It will give you suggestions. Spring dot data source dot driver class. Guys, if you are using Oracle data source properties, you need to configure. If you are using MySQL data source properties, you need to configure. Spring data source driver class name JDBC : Oracle : thin : localhost : 1521/xe. This is URL of my Oracle database. Are you guys able to follow me? This is my Oracle database. Okay, perfect. URL. Sorry, I have given wrong. This is URL, guys. This is URL. Driver class name oracle.jdbc.driver.oracle driver. Username for my database is IES_dev. Password is also IES_dev. So this is my database configuration. Spring dot data source dot driver class name oracle.jdbc.driver.oracle driver. Then spring dot data source dot URL JDBC : Oracle : thin : localhost : 1521/xe. Spring dot data source dot username, which is IES_dev, and spring dot data source dot password, that is IES_dev. These are keys are fixed, values can change. Here in this data source, keys are fixed, the values are going to change. If you want to use a MySQL database, MySQL properties you will configure. As I am using Oracle database, I am configuring Oracle data source properties. Perfect. Our application is ready. See the steps now. Set up the database server. It is done. Oracle database already running in my system. Create a table. Yes, I have given the query also to create the table in the database. Create a boot application. I have created the boot application with the starter data JPA and Oracle driver. Dependency I have added. Create entity class and map with the database table. Create repository interface and configure data source properties in application properties. Test the application functionality. Test the application functionality by calling repository methods. Test the application functionality by calling repository methods. Okay, I have configured everything. XE is my database name, guys. Some people database name may be ORCL. My database name is XE. XE is my database name, Express Edition. XE means Express Edition. It is the database name of my Oracle. Okay, things are good. Now go to start class. Guys, here I am not doing anything. First, let me run this application and show you what is happening in the console. Just run this application as a Spring Boot application. I'm just running the application. Spring Boot application execution will begin from start class. Na? Spring Boot application execution is beginning from start class. Spring Boot application execution is beginning from start class. Very good. Boot application execution is beginning from start class. Spring Boot application execution is beginning from start class. Now, can you guys read the messages available in the console? Can you guys read the messages, guys, from here to here? Just these are the log messages of our application. Can you please read the messages from starting to ending? Starting, completed. So what happened here? Just to try to understand by reading these messages, guys. Just read these messages.
వచ్చేస్తుంది ఇప్పుడు నా అడుగు వచ్చిందంటే ఎన్న మరి ఏడవుతుంది ఇంట్లో ఏయ్ పిల్ల పిల్ల చూడు అక్కడ
Are you guys able to read it?
ఎవరాళ్ళే ఫోన్ వాళ్ళ
నల్లగా ఉందా
ఝాన్సీలో వదినా
అదే
కాలు రోడ్డు మీద చూడు
Completed? All of you?
కదా అవునా కదా లగ్గి పని కొత్త ఇంట్లో ఉండకూడదు ఇలాంటివి అబ్బుతాయి సన్నసి మొగడు పనులు చూసుకోవాలి దేని దానికే చూసుకోపోతుంది
Stop it.
దేనికి డబ్బు
Get that wrong.
Yeah. Here if you see, application started bootstrapping the JPA repositories in default mode. That means in your application, if there is any repository, that will be bootstrapped. Bootstrapping nothing but loading. Bootstrapping nothing but loading. Connection pool. As we have configured data source properties, connection pool got created. Okay. Then Hibernate. Internally, it is using Hibernate. Data JPA internally using Hibernate. Okay. Once it is done, connection got closed. Connection pool got shut down. Right. Now, here I need to insert the record. In order to insert the record, I need to call the method provided by repository. Okay. So I got context. First, I need to get the repository bin object. I need to get the repository bin object. Context.get bin of user repository dot class. Context.get bin of user repository dot class. Okay. Now I am going to get user repo. Guys, tell me, do you know what is the purpose of get bin method? Can you guys tell me, do you know what is the purpose of get bin method? Come on. Come on. Do you know what is the purpose of get bin method? To get the object from the IOC container. User repository is a class or user repository is an interface. User repository is a class or it is an interface. Can IOC create the object for the interface? Can IOC create the object for the interface? No. Then how can we get the object of that? Can we get the object of the repository? Let us see which object it is going to give. System.out.println of user repo dot get class dot get name. Get class dot get name. Run this. Run this. What it is going to give us? What it is going to give us? Which class name it is giving? Which class object it is giving? Proxy. That means for our repository interface, implementation class is creating as proxy. For our repository interface, implementation is creating as proxy. Proxy class is getting created in the runtime. Got my point?
అప్పుడు మేము అక్కడే ఉన్నాము ఇది నేను ఉన్నాము వాళ్ళ ఇది జాంచి వాళ్ళ తిరుగుతున్నారు అటు ఇటు
Proxy is the dummy class which will be created in the runtime. Proxy is nothing but a dummy class which is going to create in the runtime. Okay. Now I want to insert the record. Okay. User repo dot save. It is expecting entity object as a parameter. User repository dot save, which is used to insert the record. Which record? Entity object we need to supply. Let us create the object for entity class and let me set some data. User, which is entity, is equal to new user. Entity dot set user ID I'm taking as 101. Entity dot set username I'm setting it as
అలా
RAM.
మాట్లాడిపోతాడు ఒకసారి బాగానే మాట్లాడతాడు.
అదే
Entity dot
భవానీ వాళ్ళ నాన్న
set user age sum 45.
పుల్లయ్య అతని పేరు పుల్లయ్య.
Next. Entity dot set user phone number.
అలా మాట
User phone number. Some long value. Right now, entity dot set user country. Let me set it as India. Okay. With this we are good. With this we are good
అవి కావాల్సి వస్తుందా ఏంటి?
to insert the record into table. Okay.
కానీ వెనకాల ఎవరో మీ నాన్న ఇంకా వెనకాల సపోర్ట్గా లేరు కాబట్టి చాలా మాట్లాడాలి పెద్ద మీ మాయాలే కదా ఇప్పుడు.
Can you see here? Run method is getting called. Run method is returning configurable application context. From that context, I am getting bean of user repository. Actually, user repository is an interface. How can we get the object for the interface? For that interface, implementation class will be created in the runtime. That implementation class object we are getting. Right now, then I'm storing, I'm creating object for entity class. I'm setting some data to the entity. I'm creating object for the entity. I'm setting some data to the entity. Then I'm calling repository.save. Save method is used to insert a record into the table. Now, after it is done, let me print one message on the console. System.out.println. System.out.println. Record inserted successfully. System.out.println. Let me write message. Record inserted. System.out.println. Record inserted. Okay. Go to database before running our application. Table is created. Let's save this. Select star from users details. Select star from users details. Can you see any data available in the table? Can you see any data available in the table? No data available in the table. Okay. Now let me run my application. Let me run my application. I have written the logic to insert a record into table using data JPA. Oh, can you see the message record inserted? Perfect. Go to the table. Select this table. Record inserted or not? Are we able to insert the record or not? Which method I am calling to insert the record? Save method I am calling. Who provided the save method? Crud Repository. Who provided the save method? Crud Repository. Crud Repository provided save method. Now tell me here, guys, are we writing any logic to load the driver, to create the connection, execute the query, close the connection? Are we doing anything, or we are just extending the properties from CRUD repository? Are we doing any code to do the CRUD operation, or we are just calling the predefined method? We are just extending the CRUD repository interface. That CRUD repository interface providing methods. Those methods I am calling by using my repository. My repository is an interface. Then how I am able to get the object for the interface? Whenever you create an interface by extending from JPA, then Spring Data JPA will load this interface and will create the implementation for this interface in the runtime by using proxy. That's why proxy class is creating for our interface. Whenever you call getBean method of this interface, proxy object is coming. I have proven that practically. What is the name of the class which is holding by this variable? This object is belongs to which class I have printed by using getClass.getName. This object I have printed, this object name I have printed by using get class dot get name. So which is what? Proxy. Proxy class object is created. So with this we are able to develop our first application by using data JPA. You cannot see the proxy class because the proxy class will be created in the runtime. So we can't see that proxy class with our eyes. We cannot see that proxy class with our eyes because those proxy classes will be created in the runtime. Okay. Are we able to complete all the steps here? Are we able to insert the record also into the table? Note. 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 Okay. User repository is an interface. Which is extending from Crud repository. JPA, data JPA will create implementation for our user repository using proxy. When we call context.getBean off, when we call context.getBean of user repository.class, it will give proxy class object. When we call context.getBean user repository.class, it will give proxy class object. Using that proxy class object, we can call Crud repository interface methods to perform Crud operations. Okay. When we call context.getBean user repository.class, it will give proxy class object. Using that proxy class object, we can call Crud repository interface methods to perform Crud operations. You got my point? Very good. So, guys, people are asking so many questions like, what is the difference between Crud repository and JPA repository? I have not discussed about it. Somebody is asking, can you show more operations? Guys, today is the first example, man. Understand it. Today is the first example I have shown you to insert. Tomorrow we will discuss about the remaining methods. There are 12 methods available. Please have some patience. I will discuss those things also. Don't worry. Aslam Sheikh will discuss about the delete, update, retrieval and everything. Okay? Don't worry about it. Someone is asking, what is the difference between Crud repository and JPA repository? First of all, I have not explained JPA repository. Just I have started one example with Crud repository. Once it is done, then we will go for JPA repository also, and I will tell you that. Why to extend from Crud repository? If you don't extend from the Crud repository, then your interface is a normal interface. Is there any use of this interface? If you don't extend the properties from Crud repository, is there any use of this interface? Is there any method available? Nothing available. So, if you want to use the data JPA, your interface should extend the properties from Crud repository. Then only it will provide you the methods. then only it will provide you the methods. Somebody having properties file issue, properties file, these are fixed keys, okay? Driver class name, URL, username, password. As I'm using Oracle database, I'm configuring Oracle details. If you are using MySQL, keys are same, just values you have to change. And sir, for the repository, is it mandatory to write the repository annotation? Not mandatory. Why? Because you are already extending the properties from Crud repository. When you are extending the properties from Crud repository, data JPA repository, writing this annotation is optional. You no need to write it. Even if you write it, nothing will happen. But it is not mandatory to write because our interface is not a normal interface. Our interface is extending the properties from Crud repository. So writing at the rate repository is optional, guys. Okay, cool. Step by step, I have given the steps. I have given all the steps how to develop our first application. I have given the table query also to create. I have given the entity class. I have given the description about the entity. I have given the interface. I have given data source properties. I have given start class also. Everything is there. If you just follow today's class note, you will be able to develop the application. First application. Please have some patience. Today is not the last class of data JPA. Today is the first session related to program. First example I have developed. If you are asking questions related to future concepts, I'm not feeling good, guys. I have not discussed those concepts yet in the class. Please wait. Please have some patience. Just movie started. You are asking questions related to climax. Please go in the proper channel. Okay? We have already prepared a plan how to teach this course. We'll go with that. Please don't interrupt by asking silly doubts and unwanted questions. Okay? Please have some patience and concentrate on the class which I am explaining. After this, practice it. All the data JPA concepts will come in the future. Don't worry about it. Samjha? Take care. Alright? So, I will upload these notes to Google Classroom. Just follow this and practice. If you are using Oracle or MySQL, there is no change to entity, no change to repository. Only data source properties will change, that's it. Repository will not change. This is common for anything. Alright, guys? Thank you. Good night. See you tomorrow.